The rise and fall of the Maratha power. The most important challenge to the decaying Mughal power came from the Maratha kingdom, which was the most powerful of the succession states. In fact, it alone possessed the strength to fill the political vacuum created by the disintegration of the Mughal Empire. Moreover, it produced a number of brilliant commanders and statesmen needed for the task. But the Maratha Sardars lacked unity and they lacked the outlook and program which was necessary for funding an all India empire. And so they failed to replace the Mughals. They did, however, succeed in waging continuous war against the Mughal Empire till they destroyed it. Sashu, Shahayu, the grandson of Shivaji, had been a prisoner in the hands of Aurangzeb since 1689. Aurangzeb had treated him and his mother with great dignity, honor, and consideration, paying full attention to their religious, caste, and other needs, hoping perhaps to arrive at a political agreement with Shahu. Shahu was released in 1707 after Aurangzeb's death. Very soon a civil war broke out between Shahu at Satara, and his aunt Tarabai at Kolhapur, who had carried out an anti-Mughal struggle since 1700. In the name of her son Shivaji too, after the death of her husband Rajaram, Maratha Sardars, each one of whom had a large following of soldiers loyal to himself alone, began to side with one or the other contender for power. They used this opportunity to increase their power and influence by bargaining with the two contenders for power. Several of them even intrigued the Mughal viceroys of the Deccan. Arising from the conflict between Shahu and his rival at Kolhapur, a new system of Maratha government was evolved under the leadership of Balaji Vishwanath, the Peshwa king of Shahu. With this change began the second period of Peshwa domination in Maratha history, in which the Maratha state was transformed into an empire. Balaji Vishwanath, a Brahmin, started life as a petty revenue official and then rose step by step. He rendered Shahu loyal and useful service in suppressing his enemies. He excelled in diplomacy and won over many of the big Maratha Sardars to Shahu's cause. In 1713, Maratha Shahu made him his Peshwa or Mukh Pradhan. Balaji Vishwanath gradually consolidated Shahu's hold and his own over Maratha Sardars and over most of Maharashtra except for the region south of Kolhapur where Raja Ram's descendants ruled. The Peshwa concentrated power in his office and eclipsed the other ministers and Sardars. In fact, he and his son Bajirao I made the Peshwa the functional head of Maratha Empire. Balaji Vishwanath took full advantage of the internal conflicts of the Mughal officials to increase Maratha power. He had induced Zulfikar Khan to grant the Chauth and Surdesh Mukhi of Deccan. In the end, he signed a pact with the Sayyid brothers. All the territories that had earlier formed Shivaji's kingdom were restored to Shahu, who was also assigned the Chauth and Sardesh Mukhi of the 6 provinces of the Deccan. In return, Shahu, who had already recognized through, though nominally, Mughal suzerainty, agreed to place a body of 15,000 cavalry at the emperor's service to prevent rebellion and plundering in the Deccan and to pay an annual tribute of 10 lakh rupees. He also walked barefoot and made obeisance at the tomb of Aurangzeb at Khuldabad in 1714. In 1719, Balaji Vishwanath, at the head of Maratha force, accompanied Sayyid Hussain Ali Khan to Delhi and helped the Sayyid brothers in overthrowing Farooq Siyar. At Delhi, he and other Maratha Sardars witnessed at first hand the weakness of the empire and were filled with the ambition of expansion in the north. For the efficient collection of the Chauth and Sardesh Mukhi of Deccan, Balaji Vishwanath assigned separate areas to Maratha Sardars who kept the greater part of collection for their expenses. This system of assignment of Chauth and Sardesh Mukhi also enabled the Peshwa to increase his personal power through patronage. An increasing number of ambitious Sardars began to flock round him. In the long run, this was to be a major source of weakness to the Maratha Empire. Already the system of Vatans and Saranjams, Jagirs, had made Maratha Sardars strong, autonomous, and jealous of central power. They now began to establish their control in the distant lands of the Mughal Empire, where they gradually settled down as more or less autonomous chiefs. Thus, the conquest of Marathas outside their original kingdom were not made by a central army directly controlled by the Maratha king or the Peshwa, but by Sardars with their own private armies. During the process of conquest, these Sardars often clashed with one another. If the central authority tried to control them too strictly, during the process of conquest, these Sardars often clashed with one another. If the central authority tried to control them too strictly, they did not hesitate to join hands with the enemies, be they Nizam, the Mughals, or the English. Balaji Vishwanath died in 1720. He was succeeded as Peshwa by his 20-year-old son Bajirao I. In spite of his youth, Bajirao was a bold and brilliant commander, an ambitious and clever statesman. He had been described as the greatest exponent of the guerrilla tactics after Shivaji. Led by Bajirao, the Marathas waged numerous campaigns against the Mughal Empire, trying to compel the Mughal officials first to give them the right to collect chauth of the vast areas and then to cede these areas to the Maratha kingdom. By 1740, when Bajirao died, the Marathas had won control of the Malwas, Gujarat, and the parts of Bundelkhand. The Maratha family of Gaikwad, Holkar, Scindia, and Bhonsle came into prominence during this period. All his life, Bajirao worked to contain Nizamul Mulk's power in Deccan. The latter, on his part, constantly intrigued with Raja of Kolhapur, the Maratha Sardars, and the Mughal officials to weaken the Peshwa's authority. Twice the two met on field of battle, and both times the Nizam was worsted and was compelled to grant the Marathas the Chauth and Sardeshmukhi of the Deccan provinces. In 1733, Bajirao started a long campaign against the Siddhis of Janjira and in the end expelled them from the mainland. Simultaneously, a campaign against the Portuguese was started. In the end, Salcete and Bessin was captured. But the Portuguese continued to hold their other positions on the west coast. Bajirao died in April 1740. In the short period of 20 years, he had changed the character of Maratha state. From the kingdom of Maharashtra, it had been transformed into an empire, expanding from the north. He, however, failed to lay firm foundations of an empire. New territories were conquered and occupied, but little attention was paid to their administration. The chief concern was the successful Sardars was with the collection of revenues. Bajirao's 18-year-old son Balaji Baji Rao, known as widely Nana Sahib, was Peshwa from 1740 to 1761. He was as able as his father, though less energetic. King Shahu died in 1749 and by his will left all the management of state affairs in the Peshwa's hands. The office of the Peshwa had already become hereditary, and the Peshwa was the de facto ruler of the state. Now he became the official head of administration and as a symbol of this fact shifted the government to Pune, his headquarters. Balaji Bajirao followed the footsteps of his father and further extended the empire in different directions, taking Maratha power to its height. Maratha armies now overran the whole of India. Maratha control over Malwa, Gujarat, and Bundelkhand was consolidated. Bengal was repeatedly invaded, and in 1751 the Bengal Nawab had to cede Odisha. In the south, the state of Mysore and other major principalities were forced to pay tribute. In 1760, the Nizam of Hyderabad was defeated at Udgir and was compelled to cede vast territories yielding an annual revenue of 62 lakhs. In the north, the Marathas soon became the power behind the Mughal throne. Marching through the Gangetic Doab and Rajputana, they reached Delhi, where in 1752 they helped Imadul Mulk to become the Wazir. The new Wazir soon became a puppet in their hands. From Delhi, they turned to Punjab and soon brought it under control after expelling the agent of Ahmad Shah Abdali. This brought them into conflict with the doughty warrior king of Afghanistan, who once again marched into India to settle accounts with the Maratha power. A major conflict of mastery over North India now began. Ahmad Shah Abdali soon formed an alliance with Najib-ud-Dawla of Rohilkhand and Sajjad-ud-Dawla of Awadh, both of whom had suffered at the hands of Maratha Sardars. Recognizing the great importance of coming struggle, the Peshwa a powerful dispatched a powerful army to the north under the nominal command of his minor son, the actual command being in the hands of his cousin Sadashiv Rao Bhau. An important arm of this force was a contingent of the European style infantry and artillery commanded by Ibrahim Khan Gardi. The Marathas now tried to find allies among the northern powers, but their earlier behavior and political ambitions had antagonized all these powers. They had interfered in the internal affairs of Rajputana states and levied huge fines and tributes among them. They had made large territorial monetary claims upon Awadh, and their actions in the Punjab had angered the Sikh chiefs. Similarly, the Jat chiefs on whom they had imposed heavy fines did not trust them. They had therefore to fight their enemies all alone except for the weak support of Imad ul Mulk. Moreover, the senior Maratha commanders constantly bickered with one another. The two forces met at Panipat on 14th January 1761. The Maratha army was completely routed. The Peshwa's son Vishwas Rao, Sadashiv Rao Bhau, and the numerous other Maratha commanders perished on the battlefield, as did nearly 28,000 soldiers. Those who fled were pursued by the Afghan cavalry and robbed and plundered by the Jats, Ahirs, and Gujars of the Panipat region. The Peshwa, who was marching north to render help to his cousin, was stunned by the tragic news. Already seriously ill, his end was hastened and he died in June 1761. The Maratha defeat at Panipat was a disaster for them. They lost the cream of their army and their political prestige suffered a big blow. Most of all, their defeat gave an opportunity to the English East India Company to consolidate its power in Bengal and South India. Nor did the Afghans benefit from their victory. They could not even hold the Punjab. In fact, the Third Battle of Panipat did not decide who was to rule India, but rather who was not. The way was therefore cleared for the rise of British power in India. 17-year-old Madhav Rao became the Peshwa in 1761. He was a talented soldier and statesman. Within the short period of 11 years, he restored the lost fortunes of Maratha Empire. He defeated the Nizam and compelled Hyder Ali of Mysore to pay tribute, and reasserted control over the northern India by defeating the Rohillas and subjugating the Rajput states and Jat chiefs. In 1771, the Marathas brought back Empire Shah Alam to Delhi, who now became their pensioner. Thus it appeared as if Maratha ascendancy in the north had been recovered. Once again, however, a blow fell on the Marathas, for Madhav Rao died of consumption in 1772. The Maratha Empire was now in a state of confusion. At Pune, there was a struggle for power between Raghunath Rao, the younger brother of Balaji Baji Rao, and Narayan Rao, the younger brother of Madhav Rao. Narayan Rao was killed in 1773. He was succeeded by his posthumous son, Savai Madhav Rao. Out of frustration, Raghunath Rao went to the British and tried to capture power with their help. This resulted in the First Anglo-Maratha War. The Peshwa's power was now on the wane. There was a constant intrigue between the supporters of Savai Madhav Rao, headed by Nana Padhani, and the partisans of Raghunath Rao. The meantime, the big Maratha Sardars had been carving out semi-independent states in the north which could seldom cooperate. Gaikwad at Baroda, Bhonsle at Nagpur, Holkar at Indore, and Sindhia at Gwalior were the most important. They had established regular administration in the pattern of Mughal administration and possessed their separate armies. Their allegiance to the Peshwas became more and more nominal. Instead, they joined opposing factions at Pune and intrigued with the enemies of Maratha Empire. Along the Maratha rulers in the north was Madhaji Sindhya was the most important. He organized a powerful European style army consisted of equally Hindu and Muslim soldiers with the help of French and Portuguese officials and gunners. He established his own ordnance factories near Agra. He established control over Emperor Shah Alam in 1784. From the emperor, he secured the appointment of Peshwa as the emperor's deputy on the condition that Mahadji would act on behalf of Peshwa, but he spent his energies in intriguing against Nana Fadnis. He was also a bitter enemy of Holkar of Indore. He died in 1794. He and Nana Fadnis, who died in 1800, were the last of the great soldier and statesmen who had raised the Maratha power to its height in 18th century. Savai Madhavrao died in 1795 and was succeeded by his utterly worthless Bajirao II, son of Raghunath Rao. The British had now decided to put an end to the Maratha challenge to their supremacy in India. The British divided the mutually warring Maratha Sardars through clever diplomacy and then overpowered them in separate battles. During the Second Maratha War, 1803 to 05, and the Third Maratha War 1816 to 19. While the Maratha states were permitted to remain as a subsidiary states, the house of Peshwas was extinguished. Thus, the Maratha dream of controlling the Mughal Empire and establishing their own empire over large parts of the country could not be realized. This was basically because the Maratha Empire represented the same decadent social order as the Mughal Empire did and suffered from the same underlying weaknesses. The Maratha chiefs were very similar to the later Mughal nobles, just as the Saranjami system was similar to the Mughal system of Jagirs. So long as there existed a strong central authority and the need for mutual cooperation against a common enemy, the Mughals they remained united in a loose union. But at the first opportunity, they tended to assert their autonomy. If anything, they were even less disciplined than the Mughal nobles. Nor did the Maratha Sardars try to develop a new economy. They failed to encourage science and technology or to take much interest in trade and industry. Their revenue system was similar to that of Mughals, as also was their administration. Like the Mughals, the Maratha rulers were also mainly interested in raising revenue from the helpless peasantry. For example, they too collected nearly half of the agricultural produce as tax. Unlike the Mughal, they failed even to give sound administration to the people outside Maharashtra. They could not inspire the Indian people with any higher degree of loyalty than the Mughals had succeeded in doing. Their dominion too depended on force and force only. The only way the Marathas could have stood up to the rising British power was to have transformed their state onto a modern state. Thus, they failed to do. Social and economic conditions of the people. India in the 18th century failed to make any progress economically, socially, or culturally at an adequate pace. The increasing revenue demands of the state, the oppression of the officials, and the greed for grade and rapacity of the nobles, revenue farmers, and zamindars, and the marches and counter marches of the rival armies, and the depredations of the numerous adventurers roaming the land made the life of people quite wretched. India of those days was also the land of contrasts. Extreme poverty existed side by side with extreme riches and luxury. On one hand, there were the rich and the powerful nobles steeped in luxury and comfort. On the other, backward, oppressed, and impoverished peasants living at the bare subsistence level and having to bear all sorts of injustice and inequities. Even so, the life of Indian masses was by at large better at the time. It was before over 100 years of British rule at the end of 19th century. Indian agriculture during the 18th century was technically backward and stagnant. The techniques of production had remained stationary for centuries. The peasant tried to make up for the technical backwardness by working very hard. He, in fact, performed miracles of production. Moreover, he did not usually suffer from shortage of land, but unfortunately, he seldom reaped the fruits of his labor. Even though it was his produce that supported the rest of society, his own reward was miserably inadequate. The state of zamindars and jagirdars and the revenue farmers tried to extract the maximum amount from him. This was as true of the Mughal state as of the Maratha or Sikh chiefs or other successors of the Mughal state. Even though Indian villages were largely self sufficient and imported little from outside, the means of communication were backward. Extensive trade within the country and between India and other countries of Asia and Europe was carried out under the Mughals. India imported pearls, raw silk, wool, dates, dried food, rose water from this Persian Gulf region, coffee, gold, drugs, and honey from the Arabia, tea, sugar, porcelain, and silk from China, gold, musk, and woolen cloth from Tibet, tin from Singapore, spices, perfumes, arak, and sugar from Indonesian islands, ivory and drugs from Africa, and woolen cloth metals such as copper, iron, and lead, and paper from Europe. India most important article of export was cotton textiles, which were famous all over the world for their excellence and were in demand everywhere. India also exported raw silk and silk fabrics, hardware, indigo, saltpetre, opium, rice, wheat, sugar, pepper, and other spices, precious stones, and drugs. Since India was on a whole self sufficient in handicrafts and agriculture products, it did not import foreign goods on large scale. On the other hand, its industrial and agricultural products had a steady market abroad. Consequently, it exported more than it imported, and its trade was balanced by import and silver and gold. In fact, India was known as a sink of precious metals. Historians differ on the state of internal and foreign trade during the pre-colonial period of 18th century. According to the dominant view, constant warfare and disruption of law and order in many states in many areas during the 18th century harmed the country's internal trade. Many trading centers were looted by the contestants for power and by foreign invaders. Many of the trade routes were infested by organized bands of robbers and traders, and their caravans were regularly looted. Even the road between the two imperial cities, Delhi and Agra, was made unsafe by the marauders. Moreover, even the rise of autonomous provincial regimes and innumerable local chiefs, the number of custom houses or chowkis grew by leaps and bounds. Every petty or large ruler tried to increase his income by imposing heavy custom duties on goods entering or passing through his territories. All the factors had an injurious health on the long distance trade. The impoverishment of the nobles, who were largest consumers of luxury products in which trade was conducted, also injured internal trade. Other historians believe that the effect of political changes and warfare on internal trade has generally been exaggerated. The impact on foreign trade was also complex and differential. While sea trade expanded, overland trade through Afghanistan and Persia was disrupted. Political factors which hurt trade also adversely affected the urban industries. Many prosperous cities, centers of flourishing industry, were sacked and devastated. Delhi was plundered by Nadim Shah, Lahore, Delhi and Mathura by Ahmad Shah Abdali, Agra by the Jats, Surat and other cities of Gujarat and the Deccan by the Maratha chiefs, Sirhind by the Sikhs, and so on. Similarly, in some areas, artisans catering to the needs of feudal class and courts suffered as the fortunes of their patrons declined, leading to the decline in cities like Agra and Delhi. The decline of the internal and foreign trade also hit them hard. in some parts of the country. Nevertheless, some industries in other parts of the country gained as an important result of expansion in trade with the European owing to the activities of the European trading companies. Moreover, emergence of the new courts and local nobility and the zamindars led to the emergence of a new city such as Faizabad, Lucknow, Varanasi and Patna and recovery to some extent of artisanal production. Even so, India remained as the land of extensive manufacturers. Indian artisans still enjoyed fame all over the world for this skill. India was still a large scale manufacturer of cotton and silk fabrics, sugar, jute, dyestuffs, mineral, metallic products like arms, metal wares, and saltpetre and oils. The important centers of textile industry were Dhaka and Murshidabad in Bengal, Patna in Bihar, Surat, Ahmedabad, and Bharuch in Gujarat, Chanderi in Madhya Pradesh, Burhanpur in Maharashtra, Jaunpur, Varanasi, Lucknow, and Agra in UP, Multan and Lahore in Punjab, Masolipatam, Aurangabad, Chakyakol, and Vishakhapatnam in Andhra, Bangalore in Karnataka, and Coimbatore and Madurai in Tamil Nadu. Kashmir was a center of woolen manufacturers. Shipbuilding industry flourished in Maharashtra, Andhra, and Bengal. Writing about the great skill of Indians in respect, an English observer wrote, in shipbuilding, they probably taught the English far more than they learned from them. The European companies bought many Indian made ships for their use. In fact, at the dawn of the 18th century, India was one of the main centers for world trade and industry. Peter of Great Russia was led to exclaim, bear in mind that the commerce in India is the commerce of the world, and he who can exclusively command it is the dictator of Europe. Once again, historians disagree whether there was an overall economic decline as a result of the decay of the Mughal Empire and the rise of large number of autonomous states, or whether trade and agricultural and handicraft production continued to grow in some parts of India, while they were disrupted and declined in other parts, with overall trade and production not suffering any sharp decline, but in fact the question is not of some progress here and some decline there, but a basic economic stagnation. While Indian economy was quite resilient and there was a certain continuity in economic life, there was no greater effervescence or buoyancy in the economic activities in 18th century than in the 17th century. On the other hand, there was a definitely declining trend. At the same time, it is true that there was less economic distress or decline in agricultural and handicraft production in Indian states of 18th century than there was result from impact of the British colonialism in the 18th and 19th centuries. Education. Education was not completely neglected in the 18th century, but it was on the whole defective. It was traditional and out of touch with the rapid developments in the West. The knowledge with which it imparted was confined to literature, law, religion, philosophy, and logic, and excluded the study of physical and natural sciences, technology, and geography. Nor did it concern itself with the factual and reasonable study of society. In all fields, original thought was discouraged, and reliance placed on ancient learning. The centers of higher education were spread all over the country and were usually financed by Nawabs, Rajas, and rich zamindars. Among the Hindus, higher education was based on Sanskrit learning and was mostly confined to Brahmins. Persian education, being based on the official language of the time, was equally popular among Hindus and Muslims. Elementary education was quite widespread. Among the Hindus, it was imparted through town and village schools, while among Muslims, through the Maulvis in the maktabs situated in mosques. In these schools, the young students were taught reading, writing, and arithmetic. Though elementary education was mostly confined to the higher castes like Brahmins, Rajput, and Vaishya, many persons from the lower caste also received it. Interestingly enough, the average literacy was not less than what it was in the British later. Warren Hastings even wrote in 1813 that the Indians had in general superior endowments in reading, writing, and arithmetic than the common people of any nation in Europe. Though the standard of primary education was indicated by modern standards, it sufficed for the limited purposes of those days. A very pleasant aspect of education then was that the teachers enjoyed a high prestige in the community. A bad feature of it was that the girls were seldom given education, though some women of the higher classes were an exception.